As you can see, we're going to talk about World War II. Now in this lecture, we're going to talk about World War II in the European theater, and then in the third lecture, we'll talk about World War II in the Pacific. These are already going to be a bit long, and trying to combine them would have just made them even longer, so I've kind of compartmentalized them a little bit. Now we left off in our last lecture with Hitler in power and how he was able to do that legally using the system to his advantage. So Hitler is firmly in power in 1933 and has undisputed totalitarian control by 1934. However, this doesn't seem so bad to many Germans because within a few years of being in power, Hitler decreases unemployment by 50%, which is significant. People are going back to work after many years of unemployment. And this is seen by a lot of Germans as Hitler following through on his promises. And a lot of Germans at this point aren't necessarily criticizing his anti-Jewish policies, but they're not necessarily endorsing them either. Some people are definitely saying, oh, he has these crazy anti-Semitic ideas, but hey, I am back at work and I'm making a steady wage. So they kind of take it in that way. Hitler is able to do this by creating a lot of new building projects, funneling money into businesses. I mean, it's under Hitler that the Autobahn is built. That's the very famous highway system in Germany where there's no speed limit. He also basically helps kick off Volkswagen. So again, putting people to work on some of these big projects. Now, one of the other things that he promised and he follows through on is breaking the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles had dictated that Germany would only have an army of 100,000 men and that they could not have an air force. Hitler argues that other European powers are holding Germany down, preventing Germany from being an equal power in Europe. And thus he begins increasing the army's numbers, and he also creates the Luftwaffe, which is the name for the German Air Force. Now the British, French, and the Americans are watching this, but short of sort of quietly protesting, they don't really do anything. And because at this point, a lot of other countries agree with him that to protect yourself, you need an army of more of 100,000 people. By the 1930s, many in the British government had come to feel really bad for punishing Germany so severely after World War I, and thought it was only fair that Germany have a decent army as well as an air force like any other major power at the time. Now, Hitler and the Nazis were very strategic and very smart. They realized that immediately going to war to gain territory would be a bad idea. So they moved, after rearming the country, expanding the military, etc., to diplomatic offensives. So they start taking territory slowly and very craftily to avoid putting themselves into a war before they feel that they're ready. Now, since no other country really raised a fuss about expanding the army, creating an air force, Hitler felt emboldened to move on to his next step, acquiring territory he believed to be rightfully Germany's. And the first of those territories was Austria, Hitler's home country. Now, remember back to our discussion of World War I. Austria was seen as a cultural sibling to Germany. Hitler, as I said, was Austrian and believed his home country and Germany should be united. Austria also had not really done well after World War I, so Hitler was able to export a lot of his arguments, his campaign promises to Austria and have them work really well there too. On March 12, 1938, the Wehrmacht, which is the name for the German army, marched into Austria. Now, interestingly, they don't meet resistance. They actually are, by and large, welcomed by cheering crowds of the Austrian people. Remember that after World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was destroyed. Austria actually suffered many of the same economic woes that Germany had. So the fact that Hitler had come to power in Germany had righted the economic situation. People in Austria were really hoping he could do the same. Plus, he was Austrian, so this was sort of a homecoming for him, a very big deal. Britain and France at this point do protest, but don't do anything else. And the reason why is that Austria welcomes Hitler and the Nazis in. How can you really do anything more when a country says, yes, we want to be taken over? It's kind of a sticky international situation. But we also have to remember World War I and the development of pacifism. And as I've said so many times, and I'll say it about a million more, you cannot understand World War II if you don't understand World War I. There really are the same war separated by a 20-year peace. Britain and France were so affected by World War I that neither country really wants to get involved in another war. They had lost so many people, spent so much money on World War I, that the thought of doing that again at this point, they really didn't have the backing of the French or the British people. So again, there's not really a lot they can do at this point. They do protest. They're very concerned about this new power block in Central Europe, but there's not a lot they can do at this point. They do take the matter to the League of Nations, but the League of Nations doesn't have any teeth. And that's one of the big problems with the League of Nations. All they can really do is yell at you, but there's no stick, right? There's no punishment really that they can enforce on people. And that will be very influential on the United Nations formation after World War II and why the UN has more abilities than the League did, because the League of Nations, again, couldn't really do much here. Now, after the Anschluss, which is the term for annexing Austria, Hitler was encouraged by the lack of British and French intervention. And so he moves to take another piece of land in Europe that he felt belonged to Germany. And that was part of Czechoslovakia, which at the time was still Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia had only become independent when the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell in 1918. So at this point, Czechoslovakia had only had about 20 years of independence and democracy. And they were a democratic nation, they had an elected president, and the piece of land that Hitler wants is on the map here in that orange color. It's known as the Sudetenland. Now, as you can see, that is on the border of Germany, on the edge of Czechoslovakia. And Hitler will argue that because many ethnic Germans lived in the Sudetenland, that should be German. And this is not dissimilar from when Vladimir Putin invaded the Crimea a few years ago, arguing that, well, there are Russians living there, so it should be ours. It's the same argument Hitler used in 1938. Now, Hitler, through a series of forcible negotiation, basically browbeats the Czechs, the British, and the French into giving him the Sudetenland in the fall of 1938. All upon this false claim that there were so many ethnic Germans there and that they weren't being treated right and they should be part of Germany. Yes, there were ethnic Germans living there, but they were not the majority population, and they certainly weren't clamoring to be part of Germany. So this is basically Hitler wanting a piece of another country and pushing other people around in order to get it. Now, in 1939, the following year, Germany will invade the rest of Czechoslovakia and take the entire country. The democratic government will have to flee. They'll actually spend the war in Britain, which is actually where a lot of European governments in exile hung out during the war. So you ended up with the Polish government there, the Czech government there, etc., etc. Now, although the British and the French are really mad at this point, they do try to convince Hitler not to do this. But they're kind of empty words, because Hitler is convinced they're not going to use their military, and he's right. Neither the British nor the French back this up with any military mobilization. And so Hitler feels like, hey, I can do whatever I want. No one's stopping me. Now, the British and the French had talked together after this and said, this is it. This is the end of what's known as appeasement. We're done appeasing Hitler. Clearly he's not done. And they had really hoped, okay, he's got Austria, now he's got the Sudetenland, maybe he'll be done. He's clearly not done. And so the prime ministers of Britain and France agree that this is it. This is the line in the sand for them. And they agree that whatever Hitler does next, they will get involved. They will declare war. And it's really easy to look at this from our 21st century vantage point and say, oh, can't believe they didn't get involved before. That's so terrible. Well, yeah, it's really easy to judge from hindsight had they interceded at this point. But at this point, we also have to remember that Britain and France, their militaries were not ready for war at all. They had dramatically scaled back their militaries, whereas Germany had been building theirs up for the previous 5 years. In the late 1930s, Germany had the best army in the world. The British and the French, not so much. So even if they had tried to militarily intercede, it would not have gone well for the British and the French. Now, the next move that Hitler makes is on Poland, and September 1st, 1939 is traditionally given as the starting date of the war in Europe. Hitler is once again encouraged by the lack of interference from other major countries. He steps up his game, completely leaves any pretense of diplomacy behind. At this point, he believes that neither Britain nor France will interfere if he actually goes full-out military invasion. Now, because he doesn't even have a tenuous claim to Poland, he invents a reason to invade, claiming that his troops on the mutual border between Germany and Poland were attacked by the Poles, which never happened. It's completely made up, but it's used as an excuse so that he can pretend this is a defensive maneuver. The Wehrmacht, the German army, then invades Poland on September 1st. Now, at this point, the Germans have an agreement with the Soviets, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named for Molotov from the Soviet side, Ribbentrop from the German side, and yes, that is Molotov, for whom Molotov cocktails are named. And this pact was that Germany was concerned, the Nazis were concerned that if they invaded Poland, the Soviets might come after them. Now, it was always Hitler's plan to invade the Soviet Union, always on his plate. Again, as we talked about in our last lecture, he hated communists and certainly didn't think much of the Slavic peoples who lived in the Soviet Union because of his racial view of the world that we talked about. But this was an ends to a means. Making this pact with the Soviets, they both agreed they were going to invade Poland on the same day. The Soviets on the eastern border, the Germans on the west, and then they would divide Poland in half between them. Now, Hitler's willing to make this deal because in the end he knows he's going to invade the Soviet Union and he'll take all of Poland. So this is a stopgap measure for this particular moment. He's not ready to invade the Soviet Union. Again, he wants to take Poland, and as we'll see, then he's going to turn his attention to knocking out France before he takes on the Soviet Union. And this is all because Hitler remembers what happened in World War I. He doesn't want to replay fighting a war on two fronts. Now, the Germans will invade with 1.5 million men. This is the largest army in the world, the best trained, the most professional, again, best army in the world. Unfortunately, the Poles don't stand a chance. Now, Poland does put up a very good fight for a few weeks, but by October of 1939, Poland is really forced into submission. The Polish Air Force is unable to do much damage because the Luftwaffe attacks them while they're still on the ground. Again, the Poles fight back, but their army is just not of the same grade as the Germans. In fact, nobody's army is as good as the Germans in 1939. Now, once Germany invades Poland, Britain and France declare war on Germany. And so, again, that's why this is the traditional start date of World War II in the European theater. Now, just as in World War I, because Britain and France have empires, this means they're able to pull people from their empires, just like they did in World War I, to help the war effort. Now, even so, it was not a foregone conclusion in 1939 that the colonies or the Commonwealth nations like Australia or New Zealand would automatically enter the war. All of these colonies and nations had fought in World War I and definitely remembered the carnage very vividly. But Hitler, basically overrunning Czechoslovakia, did much to persuade the colonies and countries like Australia and New Zealand, who by this point had gained independence, it convinced them to join the war on kind of, behalf of freedom and ideas like that. Many Australians, New Zealanders, and Canadians felt a certain loyalty to the home empire, and that definitely impacted their enlistment. You see a lot of men from these nations enlisting voluntarily. India actually contributed the most soldiers of the entire war. They actually contributed about 2.5 million soldiers. 62,000 of them were killed. And that's despite the fact that at this point, Gandhi, Nehru were fighting for independence from the empire through the All Indian Congress Party. And the All Indian Congress Party said, look, we did this before in World War I, and we got squat out of it. We're not fighting for the empire again if they won't give us independence. So this is a pretty big thing, right? That even though the Nationalist Party said, no, we don't want to do this, 2.5 million Indians volunteered for the war effort. Now these pictures are on the bottom left is a picture of Australian airmen in England, and on the right is the first contingent of Indian soldiers to arrive in France in 1939. Now, once the Germans took out Poland, they're going to switch, as I said, and focus on taking out France before the Soviets. But it's worthwhile to spend a minute talking about how the Nazis waged war. And it's now been summed up in a term that I'm sure you've all heard, blitzkrieg, which gets overused if you ask me. But blitzkrieg means in German, lightning war. Now, interestingly, the Germans did not invent this term. It was actually invented by Western European newspaper reporters as a way to encapsulate how the Germans were fighting the war, lightning war. The military strategy of the Germans focused on a revolutionary combination of air, tank, and ground infantry support. That may sound not that revolutionary today, but in World War II, this was really the first time in history that such a combination had been used, and it was honestly the greatest strength of the German army, to the point that it will allow the Germans to steamroll Poland, steamroll France, make it very far into the Soviet Union. They also used tank divisions. That also doesn't seem that crazy in 2017, but when you think about that, tanks were honestly just death traps in World War I. They'd come a long way by World War II. The Germans were the only ones that had sole tank divisions, which meant those Panzer tanks could move super lightning fast, right, cover a lot of ground, and also would be incredibly terrifying if you saw a tank division coming at you. They didn't have to wait for the infantry to catch up. The French and the British at the time had tanks, but they were a few tanks attached to infantry divisions. So again, then you have to work coordinating between the infantry and the tanks, and again, it really holds up the speed of the tanks. So this is one reason that the Germans can move so incredibly fast. And honestly, their tank skills is really what allows them to do the damage that they do. And anytime in World War II you see the tank divisions get bogged down, that's usually when the Germans lose a battle, as we'll see. Now, the whole point of blitzkrieg was to create high intensity, short warfare. Move through, boom, take things, move on. And that's all because of World War I. No one wants to get bogged down again in a trench-style war. The goal here of the Wehrmacht is to move in, at this point, knock out France, turn their attention onto Britain, then to the Soviet Union, in the hopes of controlling all of Europe and the Soviet Union to propagate that pure Germanic race. Again, like I said in our last lecture, Hitler's racial policy is his foreign policy. It's why and how he wages this war. Now, in terms of the fall of France, I know in the US it's really easy for us to poke fun at how fast France fell. But it's really important to understand why. After World War I, France reevaluated its military strategy, and they concluded that having an offensive battle plan had been a really bad idea. So in the interwar years, they focused on a defensive plan. They basically 180'd it completely. They built up their forts along their border with Germany because Germany was still seen as an enemy and they didn't want to replay World War I. But the weird thing to me is that they don't put any forts along their border with Belgium, assuming, as they had before World War I, that Belgium's a neutral country. Germany wouldn't dare come through there again, which seems like faulty logic to me. Now, the Wehrmacht, their plan will be for the invasion of France is sort of a two-pronged approach. The Wehrmacht will send a diversionary force through Belgium. This convinces the French that the Germans are just replaying World War I, the same thing, wheeling up through Belgium, coming down to take Paris. The British and the French also think that the British, I should say, also think that the Germans are replaying World War I, and the British and the French both move their forces to meet the Germans at the border of Belgium and France. At this point, it's looking very 1914. Unfortunately for the Allies, this was not simply a replay, as the Germans had sent their panzer tank divisions through the Ardennes forest towards the border between Germany and France. And by this point, these forts were guarded by basically a skeleton crew and presented very little challenge to these impressive tank divisions. This means they're able to roll into France unimpeded, and they ultimately take France within 3 weeks. That's all it takes. That's how impressive the Wehrmacht is. So here you can see the map of how they do this. They are able to move through Belgium very quickly. It's after this that you have the evacuation of Dunkirk, which the movie for that is coming out very soon. And I'm actually, frankly, really surprised there hasn't been a major movie about that before. Now, the famous rescue at Dunkirk, there was about 338,000 British and French troops who got stuck on the beach near Dunkirk, unable to really leave, unable to go the other direction because they were blocked in by the Germans. Now, Hitler could have had his army press forward and kill or capture all these men, but he didn't. And this is one of the great questions of World War II history. Many historians speculate that perhaps he realized that the muddy terrain of northern France would have been bad for tanks, would have made them unusable. Some historians have argued that Hitler didn't realize just how many Allied soldiers were stuck there. But the point of Dunkirk and why it's really held up as this powerful moment in the war is because most of those soldiers were ultimately rescued and taken to England to fight another day. And this preserves the British Army to later fight in the Battle of Britain and then in the invasion of Normandy. Had Hitler taken out these soldiers, the war would have been completely different. Utterly different direction. So, by the summer of 1940, this is Europe. You can see how much territory Germany has taken. They've also taken Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Denmark, have control in Norway. Then they have their allies in Italy with Benito Mussolini. They also have allies in Romania, Hungary. This is a very scary map in the summer of 1940, as you would expect. Really, at this point, Great Britain is the only ally left standing at this point. And that puts Britain in a really difficult position. Now, Hitler doesn't like this. He doesn't want Britain out there as a potential enemy. Now, Hitler actually really revered the British. He admired British culture, possibly the only other group of people he admired. And he didn't want to lay waste to Britain. But ultimately, that's exactly what Hitler and the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, will do. Hitler had really hoped that the fall of France would force Britain to surrender as well, now that they were virtually alone. But that was a false hope. So to beat the British into submission, he chose to bomb the crap out of them. The Battle of Britain, also known as the Blitz, was a revolutionary battle in military history. This is the first battle that is fought entirely in the air. This is not fought between two armies. It's fought between two air forces. Now, the first phase was or this was intended, I should say, as a first phase that was meant to blaze the way for a later land invasion. Britain has always had the advantage of being across the English Channel from Europe, and that has definitely stymied a lot of invasions, and it's true in World War II as well. Hitler was concerned about what a land invasion would do. But regardless of how many bombs were dropped or how many civilians died, the British did not buckle. And this is where the now overly used saying of keep calm and carry on came from. That was British propaganda to encourage the British to keep calm and carrying on. That if they could outlast Hitler, then they would win. They hunkered down and did indeed carry on. Both sides suffered seriously, but ultimately this will end up being a loss for the Germans, and Hitler had to stop. It became very clear after a year that the British weren't going to give in, and Hitler could not continue to expend all these resources on this when he had a much bigger agenda to get to. Now, this is an incredibly important battle for several reasons. First, it was a strategic defeat for the Germans, but the implications of it would not be realized until much later. This is the first time that the Nazis are checked. The very first time. The first time they meet with enough resistance to force them out. Now, at the time, this is not like the British are celebrating after this, because major cities have been bombed into rubble. But it's very important because the second reason, it keeps Britain in the war. If Britain had submitted to the Germans, there's no invasion of Normandy. There's no allies winning in Europe. So this is incredibly key to ultimately the Allies winning the war. Now, as we talked about with the World War I lecture, after World War I, the U.S. had chosen a policy of isolationism. The U.S. didn't want to get involved in world politics anymore. They really saw Hitler and all this stuff as a European problem that wasn't theirs. And they were able to maintain that idea until Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Now, we'll talk more about Pearl Harbor when we talk about the Pacific Theater, but it's worth mentioning here because, of course, it drags the United States into the war. The Japanese allies of Germany bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The U.S. at this point has been supplying tanks, planes, technology, and food to Britain under the Lend-Lease Act, which had been passed in March of 41. Germany interpreted this as a support of the Allies and thus saw the U.S. as a legitimate target. Japan, as we'll see more in our next lecture, saw the U.S. as a huge threat to their growing Pacific Empire. Now, the United States, through the Lend-Lease Act, had lent $50.1 million in 1941 money to Britain as well as China, other allies. $639 billion in today's money. You can see why Germany would see that as sort of you're taking sides. Now, the United States will make their debut fighting in Europe and then eventually get into the Pacific. Again, we'll talk about that in our next lecture. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to cover every battle in either theater, so that is unfortunate. But I'm hoping that if this is something you're interested in, this will spark your curiosity and you'll go off and kind of do a little bit more in-depth research on aspects you're interested in. Now, also in 1941 is a very big year of the war. This is also when Hitler feels ready to launch his invasion of the Soviet Union, which is codenamed Operation Barbarossa. Now, remember that I said Poland was divided. They had this agreement between them. But as I said, Hitler had always intended to betray Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Now, in 1941, when Britain refused to fall, Hitler then turns his attention to the Soviet Union in the hope that, okay, fine, I'll go knock out the Soviets and then I'll deal with the British since they refuse to fall. If Britain wouldn't fall and allow Germany to expand that direction, then the Soviet Union had to go. Because remember, he's trying to create a space for more of this pure Germanic people. That's his entire goal here. It's called Lebensraum, living room. He wants to annihilate all these other people to make room to send German settlers out there to create new colonies of pure Germans. Now, German economic planners drafted plans for the Soviet Union once it became a colony. The general design of this plan was as follows. The Germans would deport, kill, assimilate, or enslave the populations there and bring what they thought was order to this frontier as they understood it. Depending upon the demographic estimates, the Germans estimated that between 31 and 45 million people would die. So this is fully acknowledged and welcomed by the German High Command. In one version of this plan, they estimated that 85% of Poles, 65% of Ukrainians, and 50% of Czechs would need to be killed. They also believed that once the corrupted Soviet cities were demolished, German farmers would be brought in to create a utopian farming community to produce for the expanding Third Reich. They thought this would make Germany a continental empire to rival the United States. Hitler imagined that Germany would deal with the Slavic peoples of the Soviet Union much the way that settlers in North America had dealt with Native Americans. Hitler knew that Germany and his expanding empire would need food to supply them, and he didn't want to repeat the mistakes Germany had made during World War I. So, obtaining the Soviet Union, resettling it, meant unlimited food for the growing empire. So the German invasion of the Soviet Union began June 22nd, 1941, and this ended up being the largest battlefront of the war. It had more troops, more casualties, and a longer battle time than any other. It was a 3,000-mile-long front at various times, and this front is the most important because this decides the war. This decides the European theater of operations. To give you an idea of how bad this was, the United States lost a total of 400,000 people in World War II. The Soviets lost 30 million. That's 8 million soldiers and 22 million civilians. So this is a hefty price tag that the Soviets pay for the war. That comes out to roughly 21,000 every day were dying in the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945. 95% of Russians born between 1921 and 1923 were killed or seriously injured during the war. And until 1943, 70% So as I said, this is the front of the entire war that really decides a lot of the Allied outcome. Now, one of the questions I always get when I teach this is, why in the world do the Nazis think that they can win this? Right? Because we know the outcome. We know this goes very, very poorly for them. But they truly believe that they can win for several reasons. One of those reasons is in 1939, the Soviet Union fought a war against Finland. And sadly, we don't have time to go into that, but it's incredibly fascinating. And the Red Army, the Soviet Army, looks so bad. I mean, they're getting their butts kicked all over the place by the Finns, who have a much smaller army than the Red Army. And this is largely because Stalin purged the army during the 1930s, which made it much weaker. They didn't have a strong officer class, didn't have good leadership. And so the Red Army looks really terrible against the Finns. And so Hitler looks at this and says, well, okay, if the Red Army can't even beat the Finns, there's no way he can beat the Wehrmacht, right, which is the best army in the world. It's a fairly logical conclusion. It just turns out to be erroneous. Because what happens is, after the embarrassments against the Finns, Stalin completely retools the army, has it basically rebuilt, actually gets better officers, and so the Red Army that the Wehrmacht will meet when they invade is not the one that looked so poor against the Finns. Now, Nazi command thought that Operation Barbarossa would take them only 6 to 8 weeks. So he thought this was going to go fairly fast. That's why they invade in the summer. The plan is we'll get in and out because no one wants to be stuck fighting a war in Russia during the winter. Now, this projected battle plan of 6 to 8 weeks for conquering the Soviet Union was a view that was shared, at least privately, by the Western Allies. Everybody thought Russia was too weak. Unfortunately, the German command never agreed on the goal of Operation Barbarossa. Was it to take territory or to beat the enemy militarily? What's the goal? You can't invade all of Russia. It's just too big. And this lack of agreement caused lingering problems throughout the rest of the war. Now, not all of German command was on board with the operation. Many of the German generals were really worried about what they called the 1812 factor. And there they're referencing when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, ended up getting stuck there in the winter, lost most of the French army. It was very embarrassing. And so they were concerned that was going to happen to them, and they were quite right to be concerned because that is exactly what ends up happening. Now on the map here you can see, I think it's really helpful to see visually where they start out from, that green solid line, you know, where their intended goal was, where they actually get to. I think that's really helpful to see, again, how much territory they're trying to cover. Initially, the Wehrmacht made significant headway. They get within 400 miles of Moscow, and it's then that they start experiencing problems, especially with their supply lines. This is a huge problem in any war. If your army's not supplied, you're not going to get very far. Fighting will take much longer than Hitler hoped. Again, they're encountering a better Red Army than they thought. He had planned to take Moscow before winter, but failed to do so. And without Moscow, the capital, there was no way the German army could claim victory over the Soviets. And this put the Germans in a very bad strategic position of fighting a winter war in Russia, which is something no one ever wants to do. Now this is a huge major problem for the Germans, is fighting a winter war. The tanks are no longer usable. The supply lines are stuck. The German troops have no winter uniforms, so many of them are getting frostbite, freezing. They have to start commandeering horses and wagons because the tanks get bogged down frozen into the ground. They're no longer useful. Pretty much bad on every side that you can imagine. Now, why did the Germans ultimately lose in the East? It will take them until 1945 to really lose, but the evidence is all there already. First of all, Russia's sheer size. Russia was 46 times bigger than Germany. It's huge. It has millions upon millions of people, and that's a lot of space, and that space can really swallow soldiers. And when you've got those long supply lines, your soldiers aren't eating, they're not getting more ammunition, they're getting nothing. So this is incredibly problematic. The kind of traditional way that historians sum this up is that Russia was too big, too cold, and too many. Some historians have argued that had the Germans treated the people they met in Russia differently, that might have helped them win. Oftentimes, when the Germans moved into a town, they were greeted as liberators because the Soviet people had been so oppressed. But the Germans and the Nazis failed to capitalize on these feelings. They don't try to win the hearts and minds of the people they're conquering, and they kill a lot of civilians as they move through because of Hitler's racial policy. They don't see the people of the Soviet Union as equal to themselves at all. Remember, the German High Command is estimating 31 to 45 million people are going to have to die. Another reason for the German loss on the Eastern Front was faulty intelligence. The Wehrmacht believed the Red Army only had 400 divisions, but once they were fighting, the divisions just kept on coming. It won't be until 1945 that the Russians begin to experience any kind of manpower shortage. So there's a whole host of reasons why the Germans do so poorly. So now we're going to turn to talking about the Holocaust, because obviously no discussion of the Second World War is complete without covering the Holocaust. Now, much as the rest of our coverage of World War II, this will be slightly abbreviated because we have so little time to make it through so much history. But why I've included it here is because it makes a lot of sense to talk about the Holocaust when we're talking about fighting the war on the Eastern Front, because they're very intricately related. So we will back up a little bit time-wise to understand how the Holocaust began. But it's important to keep in mind that Hitler did not start off his rule of Germany by killing the Jewish people. He didn't come to power in 1933 and start killing people. He took a very slow approach. When he first took power, he enabled restrictive laws that gradually alienated the Jewish people from the non-Jewish population of Germany. Hitler would also go through ebb and flow periods where there'd be a lot of policies passed against the Jews, and then there'd be a year or two of nothing, and then a bunch more policies, which lulled the German Jewish population into a sense of false security. Now, in 1933, he does pass restrictive laws which ban Jews from working in the government, from being lawyers, from being professors. So he does come out pretty heavy-handed with that. But then he takes a couple years off. And a lot of Jewish Germans said, well, maybe that's it. You know, unfortunately, as I mentioned in the last lecture, the Jews of Europe were sadly quite accustomed to discrimination and have this, at the time, very keep your head down attitude. Eventually things will get better. And so that's what they thought was happening here again. Now, in 1935, Hitler passes something known as the Nuremberg Laws. And this is where the Nazis define legally what they mean by Jewish. Now, being Jewish is not a racial group. It's a religion. It can be an ethnicity, certainly, but it's not a racial group. But the Nazis are not really concerned with accuracy, ever. And they defined being Jewish as someone who had 3 or more Jewish grandparents. So what you started to have to do after 35 was to prove, through marriage licenses, etc., your heritage, whether you were Jewish or not. And this was part of the law for the protection of German blood. And the idea of the law for protection of German blood was that Jews could not marry non-Jews. Because Hitler is so intent on creating a perfect Germanic race, and he sees the Jews as the ultimate poisoner of that perfection, he doesn't want Jews and non-Jews having children, or even having sex. I mean, even if it doesn't result in a child. This created a lot of problems for people who were already in that situation and already married. And that ends up creating a lot of problems once the deportations begin. But the whole goal of the Nuremberg laws was to continue to separate the Jews politically, legally, and socially, to make them a pariah group. And again, Hitler does this so piecemeal that nobody's really fighting back, honestly. I mean, the Jewish people are. They're trying to push back. But Jews made up only about 1% of the German population. There was less of them than there were of non-Jews. And so, unfortunately, the Nazis, given their viewpoint, did not take these criticisms seriously from various Jewish groups. Now, in 1938, you have a very famous event known as Kristallnacht, which means Crystal Night in German, or it's also known as the Night of Broken Glass. Now, this is a night that was sanctioned by Hitler unofficially. Officially, he told the German people he didn't know who did it, but he absolutely knew. And he basically green lights the attacking of Jewish synagogues, Jewish businesses, and Jewish people throughout Germany. 7,000 Jewish businesses are destroyed, 100 Jews are killed, thousands more are tortured. It's known as Kristallnacht because there was so much broken glass from windows being busted out. In the street, all this glass with the moonlight reflected was apparently quite an eerie sight, but there's so much glass, that's why they call it the Night of Broken Glass. This picture is quite famous. Again, these broken out windows. A lot of Jewish business owners are unable to recover from this because their stores were also not just broken into, but looted as well. And again, Hitler ordered this. He gave these people a free pass to do this destruction. And again, this is further alienating the Jewish Germans from the non-Jewish Germans. Now, the Holocaust as we know it really begins with the invasion of Poland and will follow when they invade the Soviet Union. As the Wehrmacht moved across Poland, as you know already, the German High Command estimated that 85% of Poles would need to die. And so Hitler gave permission for Polish society to be reorganized along his concepts of race. Again, Hitler's racial policy is his foreign policy. And this meant that as the Wehrmacht conquered areas of Poland, they moved all the Jewish populations in Poland into ghettos. And in Poland and Eastern Europe, there is a much higher percentage of Jews, unlike in Germany. Many Jews died in these ghettos as food was scarce and disease was rampant. And this is the beginning of what we now know as the Holocaust, wherein Hitler's plan was to rid Europe of all of its Jews. A group known as the Einsatzgruppen followed behind the Wehrmacht, systematically rounding up Jewish citizens and murdering them. Often these people were forced into large fields, made to dig large trenches, and stand in front of them to be shot. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed in this way as the Nazis moved east towards Russia. Roughly 1 million people died in this way in a 2-year period. And the German High Command will tell the German soldiers doing this, they'll say, hey, this isn't your fault. You don't have to feel bad about this. You're just following orders. And that concept of just following orders will be called into question after the war at the Nuremberg trials, where the Allies will say there's a limit. There's a limit to what you should do as a soldier, and there is a limit to what you should ask soldiers to do. So here's an image, again, of people disrobing. The Nazis, as I'm sure many of you know, took everything they could from the people they killed, oftentimes sending it back to Germany for the German people. I've tried not to include too many pictures. I think it can be easy to become desensitized to the Holocaust, but I think nonetheless it's important to know this. Now, as the Nazis continued to move eastward, they created the camps that we are now most familiar with. Many camps had existed since the late 30s, mostly as prison camps for political prisoners and things like that. They were not death camps at that point. But the Nazi high command did not like that more people were not being killed, and so they wanted to create a systematic way to basically murder as many people as possible. And so they built 6 camps that were specifically designed to be extermination camps, death camps. So these are Auschwitz, Chelmo, Belchik, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Treblinka. And I'm sure many of those names are very familiar to some of you. In these camps is where the gas was used, Zyklon B, which, as I'm sure many of you know, when they got off the cattle car at the camp, they were sorted into healthy and non-healthy. The deemed unhealthy people were taken into supposedly get a shower, where they were then gassed with Zyklon B. Jews from all over Europe were sent to both concentration camps and death camps. Beatings, torture, terror, starvation, and medical experiments characterized the treatment at these camps. Now, it was not just the Jews that were sent to these camps. You also had the Roma people, gay and lesbians, prostitutes, political dissents, amongst many other groups of people. Now, the Jews do make up one of the largest groups in the camps, but again, there's a lot of people being thrown into these camps, all of whom are seen by Hitler as not worthy of life. Now, some people still try to deny that the Holocaust happened, even though there is incontrovertible evidence, much of which came from the Nazis themselves. Those pictures on that previous screen, those were all taken by the Nazis. They would send those pictures home to their parents, like, look at what I'm doing. And that, honestly, is largely what the Nuremberg trials by the Allies will be based on, is evidence from the Nazis themselves. They're saying, look, they took these pictures. You can't argue that we made this up. Now, here is a map of all the camps in Germany, Poland, and then one in Austria. There were more. So the green denotes concentration camps. So these camps were also bad. I don't want it to sound like it would have been easygoing. Not at all. But these were camps that were built initially as prisoner camps and then later had things added to them like gas chambers, the ovens. But they were not specifically built to be extermination camps. When I was in high school, I went to Germany for a study abroad, and I went to Dachau concentration camp, which, as you can see, is in southern Germany. And it was one of the most moving experiences of my life. And if you haven't been to one, if you go to Germany, I know it sounds like a weird thing to do on your vacation, but it's very powerful. It's very, very powerful. I highly recommend it. But for instance, at Dachau, there were no gas chambers. There were ovens. But again, people, the same horrifying conditions were imposed on them as well. Many died in these camps also. The red denotes those camps that were specifically built to exterminate. So those ones all had gas chambers, ovens, and a lot of the deaths of the Holocaust were in those 6 camps. That's not to say the other ones didn't have high death tolls, they did, but because of the intention of the other 6, thus their higher death toll. You'll see all these 6 death camps are all located in Poland. That was very intentional. Poland had a very, very high Jewish population, but Jews from all over Europe could be sent there. Now, the death toll for the Holocaust is, as you can see, absolutely staggering. The accepted number for Jewish deaths is 6 million. 3 million of those died in the camps. The other 3 million died by the Einsatzgruppen, being rounded up, being shot in the street, things like that. That accounts for 2 out of every 3 European Jews. This absolutely decimates the population of European Jewish people. In addition to that, 9 to 10 million Slavic peoples and Roma peoples were killed in the camps as well. So these camps, again, are incredibly deadly. Now, the map there I know isn't the best quality, but you can see the red dot in the middle. That's the camp at Auschwitz. And you can see from the lines how far away they were sending Jews from that ultimately died at Auschwitz all across Europe, the Soviet Union, again, incredibly far. Now, one of the other questions I oftentimes get asked about the Holocaust is, well, what did we know? What did the Allies know? What did Americans know? And for a long time, it was really popular for the Allies to deny that we knew anything. And that's wrong. When I was in your position, when I was in undergrad, I had a professor who taught a World War II class. And one of our assignments was we had to go find a newspaper article from an American newspaper on microfilm, because, not to make myself sound old, but there was no digitized anything yet. And so we had to comb through microfilm, and I found an article on the front page of the New York Times from 1942 talking about the camps. Pretty hard to deny we didn't know that was happening if it's on the front page of the New York Times. So yes, the US and the Allies did know. Did we know exactly how bad? That varies. There was the Polish underground, many other underground operations that got word out to the Allies about how bad these camps were. So we knew a lot. How much the average American knew or the average British citizen knew was probably not as intensive, because obviously the US and the British would not want to publicize this. Now, the other question I always get is, well, what could we have done about it? Many historians have pointed out a lot. We could have bombed the rail lines. We could have bombed the camps themselves. Now, people who aren't a fan of that argument about bombing the camps have said, well, then you would have killed all the people in the camps, right? Is that really helpful? And many survivors of Auschwitz, etc., have been asked this question. And more often than not always, but more often than not, they say, I would rather that the camp had been bombed and died than to continue suffering the way that I did. And that's a pretty profound statement. But the Allies, basically what it comes down to is the Allies did not want to expend the effort or the money to dealing with this. And so the argument between Churchill and FDR was, well, we'll win the war and then that will stop this. So yes, the Allies could have done more than what they did. Now, to return back to the military part of the war, how did the Allies go about winning? Because when we left off, Hitler and the Nazis looked like they were pretty unstoppable. But what will happen is that the Soviets on the Eastern Front will really grind up the Nazi army. And they will really deplete the Nazis of their best soldiers. Now, the Soviets will say, hey, other allies, Britain, and the United States, we could really use some help. We're taking the full brunt of the war right now. And so this is when the Allies plan for what is now known as D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, which takes place June 6th, 1944, precisely at 7 in the morning. Now you can see from the map where the various Allied forces leave from, and you can see where they land on the Normandy coast. Now, I know in American history it's really easy to act like we were the only ones there. We weren't. It was Americans, the Brits, Canadians, as well as elements of the French army that had been able to escape France and live in Britain and be part of this force. Now, there were 5 invasion beaches. Gold, Juno, and Sword are the British and Canadian beaches. And then the very famous Utah and Omaha are the American beaches. Now, if you have seen Saving Private Ryan, they do a very good job of showing what the landing would have been like. It would have been incredibly chaotic, incredibly terrifying. But by the end of the day, the Allies have taken out the German guns on the beach, and from there, they will slowly push back the Germans for almost a year. It will take them to ultimately push the Germans back to Berlin itself. And the Allies take an approach of saying, we will not accept anything but an unconditional surrender. So what that means is there's no negotiating. An unconditional surrender means you give up and you take the deal that you're given by the other side. Some historians have argued that probably made the Germans and the Japanese fight even harder than they already were, knowing that there was no middle ground. But the Allies did this because after World War I, they had tried to give well, they'd done a pretty poor job, but they felt like they had tried to have more of a negotiation and that Germany had just risen again. They didn't want to go through that for a third time. Now, the Allies were at this point fixated on, again, slowly pushing the Germans back to Berlin. The Soviets are pushing back from the east. The British and Americans are pushing from the west, slowly moving in until May of 1945. The Soviets get to the capital of Berlin first and lay siege to the city. The Battle of Berlin is definitely one of the bloodiest of an already very bloody war, partially because Soviet soldiers were pretty ticked off at this point. They'd been fighting 4 years and they were pretty angry. And you see scenes from the end of the war in Berlin of this. The last sort of defenders of Germany are children, 10, 12 years old, who'd been indoctrinated by the Hitler Youth Program, who believed it was their duty to die for Germany. It's absolutely mind-blowing to think about. Ultimately, the Soviets are successful. Germany surrenders May 8th, 1945, and that's now known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Now, Hitler, also I should mention, Hitler commits suicide at the end of April. There's